Hej och välkomna tillbaka till Erik Banks Temadag Healthcare. Nu har jag äran att presentera Morten Henneveld från OssDsign. Välkommen, kör hårt.
Thanks for having me. Good morning everyone and welcome to OssDsign's presentation. As always, when we do these things, we have the normal disclaimer. Just for, in case there anyone new to OssDsign, we are a Swedish company. We are headquartered in Uppsala. We are about 50 employees and operate actually in 10 markets globally. Everywhere we operate, we are fully patented and we have full regulatory clearance, and we also have fully reimbursement. And then just on Tuesday this week, we also posted a very impressive 33% growth for 21. So something we're very proud of. But just before we get into the details, I want to talk a little bit about the clinical challenges and really the reason that we are here. Today, OssDsign have two franchises. We are in what we call CMF, the cranial business, and then we also have a bone graft business that we right now target for spinal surgery. If we look at the unmet clinical need in those, then unfortunately, a lot of people get traumatic brain injuries and need an implant. The biggest issue we see is really what we call post-op infections. And the literature clearly shows that around 10% of all these patients actually end up with infections, most of which will have to have an explantation, so removal of the implant. If we look at spine, the problem is even worse. It's about 20% of everyone that have a surgery that doesn't get the clinical outcome, which is what you call a fusion. Now, if you add all of this up, we're talking hundreds of thousands of patients every year who doesn't get what they deserve. It's extremely painful for the patients. They have to undergo multiple revision surgeries potentially, but it's also extremely burdensome and costly to the healthcare society. So we are addressing some very real unmet clinical needs. So how do we respond to that? Well, what we have in our cranial PSI product and our bone graft OssDsign Catalyst, I'll go into it in a little bit more detail in a second. Those are really the next generation bone replacement products. And what is it that makes them so special? Well, it is essentially, we've designed them to stimulate the body's own healing capabilities. The body is a fantastic phenomenon, and what we essentially do is catalyzing that to happen in a faster way. If we start with our OssDsign Cranial PSI, so for cranial procedures, then we have now consistently shown, since the first study in 2018, very low observed complication rates. We just published updated post-market surveillance data on almost 1,500 implants across 214 hospitals, and now we're showing a much bigger cohort, and actually clinical outcomes have improved with only 1.6%. So that needs to be seen in the context of the 10% I spoke about before. We also just received an osteoconductive claim in the US, which means that the bone resorbs and turns into bone during the healing process. To our knowledge, we are the only ones in the US market that can say that. If we look at the bone graft, the OssDsign Catalyst, then it's preclinical, but it's extremely strong preclinical data. It's done in something called a Boden model. It's a very discriminating preclinical model. And when we compare that to other products on the market that have done their preclinical work in the same model, then we really outperform it. And we showed 100% fusion rates after 26 weeks in that model. So something we are very proud of, and of course something we use actively as we are right now commercializing in the US. So where is OssDsign right now? Well, OssDsign is becoming a broader company with a lot more potential. Previously, we were only in the cranial business. Now we've also entered the bone graft market. And what that means for OssDsign is that we now have an addressable market which is 5 times bigger, actually amounting to $3 billion in potential in our addressable market. So it's a very significant shift from where OssDsign was before and where OssDsign is right now. For the Catalyst, our bone graft, it can actually be used in multiple places. We are actually cleared for more than spine, but we have a very specific focus to address the spine segment. And why do we do that? Well, clearly, as you see here on the presentation, it is by far the biggest part of the bone graft market. It's also an area where we can leverage the overlap we already have with neurosurgeons. And then as it happens, there are many people in OssDsign that actually have previous experience with spine and bone graft. And therefore, we know the surgeons, we know the sites, so it's very obvious for us that that is the place to focus. But I also want to talk a little bit about our commercial infrastructure, because I feel that's something that's quite unique to a company of OssDsign size. As you can see here, we're headquartered in Uppsala, as I said. We have direct operations in the main markets in Europe. We have agents and distributors in Southern Europe. Then we have a direct subsidiary, direct sales, and a subsidiary in the US, working with a very broad network of agents. They're called distributors, but working as agents. Then we also have main distributors more towards the east and of course, in Japan. So we don't need to build this. We have this in place, and that, of course, means that we are leveraging this very heavily as we are commercializing, as we are growing, as we are broadening the company out. I also wanted to take the opportunity to give you a little bit of a status on where we are on our clinical programs. If we start with our cranial franchise, then really the key thing here is the post-market surveillance that I just talked about before. It is by far the best data source you have, because it covers all types of surgeries, the easy, the difficult, and many different surgeons and sites. We continue to collect that data, and we publish that on an annual basis. We're also working with KOLs to try to set up cranial registries. And why do we do that? Well, we do that because we know that every time there are studies comparing OssDsign to the market or to maybe specific competitors, then we come out better. So it is in our interest also to get more data published. And unfortunately, cranial is not the space where there is most publication. So we're trying to make that happen. For OssDsign Catalyst, we started our Top Fusion study. We launched it in the US in August. In September, we started our first clinical study called Top Fusion. We have now recruited 75% of all subjects. We expect to complete that in the coming month. And then we've also decided to set up a very important registry in the US called Propel, which is a multi-center prospective spinal fusion registry. And why do we do that? Well, a registry is a perfect addition to clinical trial, and it's really bridging the gap between a controlled clinical trial and how the product actually works in real-life settings. It also means that we can collect a lot of data in a much shorter time span, and we are collecting very broad data sets, so we can look at specific patient groups, on indications, and of course we can use that actively to write white papers and use that actively in the commercialization of the product. So we just announced our Q4 and our full year report, and I have to say it's been an extremely eventful year for OssDsign. It's also been a year that in many ways really marks the start of a new era. Early in the year, we launched our new strategy, Ascend 25, which is really a strategy focusing the company on serving neuro and orthopedic spinal surgeons. And as part of that, we set 5 very clear priorities that we live and breathe every day, that are fully institutionalized in how we operate and execute in the company right now. As I said, during the year, we also built a new franchise in the company, bone graft. We launched that ahead of our own internal planning in August in the US. Then we also boasted 3 times consecutive sales record quarters during the year. And I think it's important to note that that applies even to our Q4, which is probably the biggest pandemic impact we've had so far. And if I compare that to what happened back in Q2 of 2022, we didn't drop like we did back then. We actually managed to grow, where we're seeing generally the market is seeing negative growth. So we really have a better robustness in our sales right now in the company. During the year, we also won 3 major GPO contracts in the US. We won Premier, Vision, really the 2 giants. But then we also won a very important contract with the military called the DAPA agreement, which we now are using actively. So it means we have much, much better access to healthcare providers in the US. As I said during the year, and as we also said we would do during the strategy presentation, we have significantly accelerated our clinical work. We started Top Fusion, we started Propel that I talked about. And then we also came out with more extensive and even better post-market surveillance data on our cranial PSI. So as I said, it's a year we're extremely proud of. We grew a total of 33% during the year. It is really a new area for OssDsign, and I really truly believe that we finished 21 in a much, much better place than where we started only 12 months before. So if I look into a little bit into the future, then I already introduced the strategy. This is our main focus. We are serving neuro and orthopedic spinal surgeons, and we have set 5 very clear priorities for the company that you see here on the presentation. We are already executing a lot of that. We are directing investment towards the US. We are broadening healthcare providers with our GPO wins. We have launched our bone graft business over time. Of course, that will become a global business as well. We will continue to innovate using the strong technology platforms we have to develop new products, to sell in the market. As I said, we've really delivered on the promise to accelerate clinical. This company is going to do a lot more clinical in 22, and we also did in 21 than what we've did in the years before. And then we know for cranial PSI that it is so powerful outcome data that we are showing right now. We need to make that even stronger and stronger commercially, and that means that we are working very, very hard on reducing the lead time so we can get it into the hands of surgeons in a shorter time span. So when I look into the important milestones here in the first half, then normally we don't actually put milestones on some of the large tenders or contracts that happens, but there is one happening in Paris. We submitted just in Q4, I believe it was. It is a very big, a very material tender. We expect to hear something probably in the next 2 months or so. So that is clearly one of the milestones that will make a tremendous difference should we win that in France. We also, as I said, we are ready to enroll sites now in our Propel, in our US spinal fusion registry. So that will happen during the first half. We also expect to complete the patient inclusion in our Top Fusion study on OssDsign Catalyst. And then we also expect to launch in Japan. We're probably closer now than what we've been before. I would say we're probably more in a soft launch mode. We have started to take the first steps, but of course Omicron arrived a little bit with a delay in Japan. So right now it's somewhat difficult to go into full launch mode, but we expect that to happen in the first half. So if I'm to summarize OssDsign, I really think we are uniquely positioned for growth. And why is that? Well, as I've shown you today, we are clearly serving a high unmet clinical need. What we are bringing to market is the next generation bone replacement product. They are different to what's out there in the market, and we also see that they work better. We see it on cranial PSI, on post-market surveillance data. We've demonstrated it in preclinical trials on OssDsign Catalyst. We have a much bigger growth potential now than we had in the past. As I showed you, a $3 billion addressable market is five times bigger than what it used to be for OssDsign. We have shown this exceptional clinical performance that I've talked about. And then we have this strong commercial presence already, which means that we have an infrastructure that we can leverage to accelerate growth. We don't need to build it from scratch. We can actually use what's already there. And then, of course, we will continue to expand that. So I think with that, that was everything I had today. Thank you very much for having me here.
Great. Thank you for a very nice presentation, Morten. So first, I was wondering, so your sales are currently held back by the corona pandemic now. Is there looking better, so to say, now than it was a year ago or so? How is it developing?
Well, I think it's been fluctuating a lot, and there's been very big regional differences. I think when the pandemic started, we felt the impact simply because our cranial business, cranioplasty or cranial surgery, just have a lower priority in many healthcare systems compared to, for instance, oncology and so on. So that was the impact we felt. I think with the arrival of Omicron and so on, that has changed the game. What we saw in Q4 and also carrying into Q1 is a much bigger blow. The impact is much bigger simply because it's driven by staff shortages. So if you don't have nurses, if you don't have anesthesiologists, then you can't do surgeries. And that's what we saw in Q4, and that's also what we've seen. Having said that, it seems to be a wave rolling, and now we're seeing here in the last week or so some improvements on the East Coast, at least in the US, and not so much more west. But we do expect that we're going to come out of it, but it's probably going to carry on for a little while yet, but not to the same extent as we've seen in the last couple of months, I hope.
Yeah, it makes sense. And about Catalyst, it's obviously a very scalable product. It's an off-the-shelf product, high gross margins, so to say. How is it with the cranial product? Can you make this more scalable in any way? It's a patient-specific implant, so you have some...
Yeah, I think it's all relative. If you compare the two franchises, then clearly there is more scalability in OssDsign Catalyst in the bone graft franchise because it is an off-the-shelf. It is also typically a much higher gross margin product, going even to 90%. Having said that, I actually think we've shown during 21 that as volumes go up also on cranial, because we have been able to grow both volume and sales, I think we showed that there clearly is an opportunity to have more scalability in our cranial PSI business than what we've demonstrated in the past, but not as much as in OssDsign Catalyst, of course.
Okay. And speaking of Catalyst, how are you different compared to the other products on the market? What is your kind of USP compared to the others?
Yeah, but I think first of all we have preclinical data that really stands out to the extent that the Spine Journal actually picked it up, which is not that typical on preclinical data. So I think that's one thing, that we're able to show so strong preclinical data, actually with 100% fusion rate after 26 weeks. Having said that, bone graft is there's a lot of products out there. There's a lot of clearances. There's a lot of competitors, but there's also a lot of old products. And what we have with OssDsign Catalyst, it is nanosynthetic. So it is probably more fourth generation compared to some of the other ones in the market. And what that means is, because you have nano at different scales, we are operating at a scale which is 1,000th of the width of a hair, right? That's the scale we are operating in. And many try to mimic the bone structure on a macro level. It gets a little bit technical now. We're actually mimicking the minimal crystals inside the bone, right? So we're operating on a much lower scale. And we believe that is actually one of the drivers behind why we see these fusion rates and that bone formation happening, not only the magnitude of the bone formation, but also the speed with which it's happening.
Great. And so you've obviously started selling Catalyst and you have studies going on, so to say. But if we look at maybe, say, 2025, 2026, what do you believe the revenue mix between these two products will be like? Just for investors to get some kind of sense, or where we see the biggest...
well, I've said before, we're not guiding how the split is going to be. We're also not, I don't dare to look at what it's going to be. But I think as you look into the future, you would see the two franchises at least becoming to some kind of parity as a minimum. Clearly, the potential on bone graft is very big. There are more surgeries happening. A surgeon for cranial may be doing a few a month. A surgeon for spine may be doing 15 to 20 a month, right? So there is a difference for the two. So as I've said before, it will become a very meaningful part of the company going forward.
And are you planning to do any additional studies after this top fusion study, sort of larger scale studies, or do you think it will be more important to get sort of real world data?
No, I think we're going to continue building. As I said, right now we're selling OssDsign Catalyst in the US. We also need to broaden that out and build a global business. And for that purpose, you do also need more data than just the top fusion. So we are already contemplating kind of the next clinical study that will happen. Exactly when and what it's going to look like, I think we'll announce that in due course. But no, clearly, this is not something that stops. I think we've actually demonstrated when we look at other successful bone graft in the market, when they actually, at which point after the launch did they actually started accelerating their clinical work. And here, from what we can see, we're starting this 3-4 years ahead, even of other companies that were successful. So I think we got off the starting block extremely quickly. I think we're making the right strategic investments early on, knowing that it takes a little bit of time to build the data. But of course, it's not going to stop with top fusion. We need to build more data.
Yeah, of course. It's all about data, right? Yeah. So I know that you don't report gross margins in your reports, but to get sort of a understanding among investors, what do you believe your gross margins will be in a few years at a more mature stage?
Well, we don't report it, which also means we don't guide on it, right? So I'll answer it more kind of generic. Clearly, as I think we've seen right now, what's happening is, geography does matter on what you report as a gross margin. We have higher ASPs in the US, and that shows clearly when we have a good quarter in the US. It clearly shows in the numbers. As we look forward, of course, I think we'll see a double effect of OssDsign Catalyst. As that franchise starts to become a bigger part of the business, it is a much higher margin product. So, of course, that's going to show in a positive way in the numbers. But also the fact that at least for a period of time, it will only be sold in the US, which is the highest priced market in the world. So we're also going to see a further positive geography mix as the US becomes the biggest part of the company.
Right. And a last question. You have made some key recruitments to OssDsign recently. Can you tell us a bit about this and what you believe these people will have impact? Clearly they're recruited because we believe they're going to have a fundamental impact. Yeah. Listen, I think it's a natural part of a company that is going from, say, being a smaller Swedish company to become a broader international company, actually with a genuine global footprint. But also a company where we've clearly accepted that US is where we need to win. So some of the latest recruitments have come in to kind of show that diversity, so we reflect the markets in which we are. So today we have 2 US natives in the management team. We have another 3 or 4 of us that have actually lived and worked in the US. Everyone have global experience. Everyone have also about 20 years of experience in their specific fields, whatever that is. And then, of course, the recent announcement of Melanie as Vice President of Clinical, well, that is exactly to deliver on what we said we would do in the strategy. We are going to do more clinical work, but also the nature of our clinical work is changing. It's no longer just with rats or mice or rabbits in a lab. It's actually much more in the market together with surgeons in a real-world setting. And that is a different type of clinical you're doing. And of course, we need to make sure that we have the competences to also execute on that. Yeah, that makes sense. Great. I think that was all from us. The
time
is running out.
Good.
Thank you very much
for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.